morning, everyone. My name is Richard Jockelson. I'm the Dean of Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. And I'm just here to bring a few remarks of thank you for your attendance and for the organizers of this conference. Before I do, I want to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Niniwak, Anzaninawak, Oyate, Denisulane, and of course the Dakota and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. What I am going to do is invite our Moro Chair, Nathan Dureko, to come up and give a few remarks and to welcome our keynote speaker. And I want to just give a round of applause for the fabulous attendance, participants, and speakers, as well as the organizing committee and team of students and volunteers that helped put on these 2 days of events. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg for the inaugural Business and Human Rights Conference of the Canadian Forum for Human Rights. It is my honor today to introduce our keynote speaker, who needs little introduction, and he's Fernanda Hopenhaym Cabrera, is a fierce advocate for human rights and an expert in business and human rights with over 20 years of vast and impressive experience on human rights, economic and gender justice, intersectionality. She has been focusing for the past 15 years exclusively on promoting corporate and financial accountability vis-a-vis these issues, leading research, community grassroots organizing, and international advocacy projects at all levels across the world. She is an independent expert and vice-chairperson of the member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and the co-executive director of the Project on Organizing Development, Education, and Research, PODER. Fernanda serves on the board of directors of Earth Rights International, All Out, and SOMA, and she is part of the advisory network on International Business and Human Rights Award Foundation. She guest lectures across the world, including at Stanford Law, University of Zurich, the University of Basque Country, and the Universidad Externado in Colombia and in Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Fernanda Hopenhaym.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm so excited. First time in Manitoba and in Winnipeg. Not first time in Canada, though, so I have experienced this winter before. I am really thankful for the opportunity to be here this morning, to see some friends and familiar faces, and also meet new colleagues and students. And I really want to thank the team at the university who really put together this event. Akin, for all your patience, thank you, and everybody else, because it took me a while to kind of figure out whether I was going to be able to make it, because as you may know, the International Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva is coming up very soon. So this is a challenging time for me, but I'm really happy to be here. And I really wanted to frame the conversation a little bit about the progress we've made in this many years of work on business and human rights, but also really acknowledging that we're in times of crisis and transformations, and that can bring a lot of challenges, but hopefully some opportunities that we can tackle together. So shall I pass it? Oh, fantastic. Great. So a little bit of history. I mean, most of the room here are very much aware of this history, but I really wanted to touch upon the fact that, you know, this agenda didn't start yesterday or when the guiding principles were adopted almost 15 years ago. The first conversations, I would say, acknowledging that businesses had, you know, something to do with human rights somehow, started happening in the 70s around some very emblematic cases. For example, in South America, where I'm originally from. I was born in Uruguay. I'm binational, Mexican as well. And, you know, we had dictatorships in the 70s in Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Brazil. And so there were very big companies involved or contributing to this coup. And then the dictatorships that came after, including disappearances of people, etc., companies involved in gross human rights violations, denouncing their own workers that were involved, let's say, in social activism or unionizing, and handing them to the military. And some of those people are still unfound. And so this gross violations and this involvement of these companies in those dictatorships in the 70s sparked a very big conversation. Many of them were from the US or from other industrialized nations. So that's where I guess the conversation started to really get serious. And then in the 80s and the 90s, there was an effort in the UN to create a code of conduct for companies because of that. There was an acknowledgement that companies needed some sort of guidance to tell them how to behave when it came to human rights. But that led us to really nothing concrete, unfortunately. Meanwhile, corporate social responsibility initiatives, philanthropy from companies started to grow, some kind of private sector owned initiatives. And then in the year 2000, with this very important person, the former Secretary General of the UN, the UN Global Compact was funded. This is a network of businesses that have need to comply with 10 principles, some of them regarding human rights, the environment, labor rights, etc. And Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General then, really was a very smart person that thought we should bring companies together to talk about these things. And he was the one that actually appointed in 2005 Professor John Ruggie, who came up with his team in 2008 with this framework, Protect, Respect, and Remedy, and finally the guiding principles in 2011. So we should never underestimate the role of Kofi Annan in this whole agenda. He was a very important character and really a visionary in a sense. Then in 2015, we had the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda, and kind of everything started to come together into these different frameworks that now coexist. Business and human rights, which is the one I prefer and always promote. We should always keep the human rights language into our efforts. ESG, responsible business conduct, sustainability, corporate social responsibility still around. We see it a lot. I live in Mexico, though I travel a lot. I don't live there as much as I would like. But I engage with Latin American companies, for example, and they are all about CSR still, right? And that happens in many, many places around the world. But we have the guiding principles, and there's been progress in the implementation. As many of you know, national action plans were kind of the first move in the implementation of the guiding principles. These are policy documents. It's really a plan. I always try to distinguish the NAPs from public policy, because NAPs are a plan. You can do an action plan with whatever you want. You want to buy a house, you do an action plan, right, for yourself, in terms of the money you have, the mortgage you can pay, et cetera, et cetera. When are you going to do it? And you kind of allocate budget to that and time, and that's a national action plan. It's really a plan that kind of really states what governments will be doing on these issues, right? About 50 countries have had NAPs so far. 35 are still in implementation somehow, or at least they have, in terms of dates, they are still valid. Though not much is happening. But there has been some development in other sectorial policies connected to BHR. For example, mining or energy policies around modern slavery, human trafficking, child labor, things related to business and human rights, though they are not called like a business and human rights policy or a national action plan. And that is also important because that gives us more tools to work. I never want to see this agenda as a narrow agenda. I think that's an intent by some people, particularly in certain sectors, to really kind of narrow it to a national action plan or something that says the guiding principles. But there are many things. What we're looking for here is to protect human rights in the context of business activities. That's our goal as a community of practice. How we do it, it needs to be a combination, a smart mix, as the guiding principles say, but really a combination of efforts that don't necessarily need to have the title business and human rights in writing. In terms of regulatory trends, there was a big push about maybe 5 years ago, a little bit before the pandemic. The pandemic kind of hit us all very hard in many senses, including in this sort of progress. But we do have some national due diligence laws in Europe. We had CSDDD. Yesterday, there was a vote by the European Parliament to move forward with Omnibus 1, the proposal. And now this is going to the trilogue, I think you call it. I always say trialogue because it makes more sense for me, like dialogue, trialogue, but it's called trilogue, which is odd. That's the conversation between the European Parliament, the European Council, and the European Commission. And they will probably come up or approve an omnibus proposal that really waters down all that we had gotten in CSDDD, CSRD, and these directives. This we really celebrated when CSDDD passed. And then before implementation started, all this conversation came. And this is part of the context we're going to be discussing in a minute. Other European directives, I think, are really also contributing to this agenda, as well as other thematic regulations here in Canada, in the UK, a lot on modern slavery in the Commonwealth countries. And I think that also has led to many companies, for example, to conduct human rights due diligence on modern slavery or child labor or a specific area. But, you know, there's a world beyond the global north. And so Asia has really progressed in some directives. Japan's guidelines are not mandatory, but they're really an important tool for Japanese companies and the government and also civil society using it. South Korea has just recovered, let's say, or re-energized its regulatory process. There was a bill presented in 2023, 2024, nothing really happened. And now it has gone back to a commission in the parliament to be discussed. So we may have a mandatory bill, you know, a new law in South Korea, and Thailand has also put forward a bill for mandatory human rights due diligence. In Latin America, Brazil has a very ambitious law proposal. It's not on human rights due diligence. It's a broad, business and human rights, let's say, law. Politics are not looking very good in terms of the composition of the parliament and the possibility of this being approved. But it's been a very important effort by civil society, lawmakers, and academia. In Chile and Colombia, they are supposed to be building their proposals for law, but now we have elections in Chile very soon, and we have elections in Colombia in May next year. And that is probably going to shift to a more conservative scenario that is going to pose new challenges. Peru and Mexico, there's a lot of momentum steered by civil society. As you may know, Peru has yet again changed its government, and they have a new president now, the sixth, I think, in like 7 years. So it's not so easy for them to move forward. And in Mexico, still to be defined. There are other obligations that I really associate with business and human rights. For example, under free trade agreements, you know, the USMCA, for example, has the forced labor ban. And I think there are some provisions, except, let's see what happens next year with the revision, my fellow North American friends, and where that takes us. But there are some interesting provisions also on labor there that are related to, you know, human rights protected in the context of business activities and trade activities. And there are other laws that bringing human rights elements, like the new mining law in Mexico approved last year, and the new environmental licensing regulation in Colombia also from last year. In terms of international instruments, some of you have been involved in the legally binding instrument discussions. A business and human rights instrument. The 10th round of negotiations or dialogues was held a month ago. It's really not moving forward. And the chair, Ecuador, the chair of the Intergovernmental Working Group, has decided not to present a new draft for next year, but really continue to negotiate the current draft, which I don't know if it's going to move somewhere, but let's see. But there are other instruments. The one on plastic, it has a very big participation from businesses. Businesses are really involved in this one and trying to move it forward, not in the first one. They're trying to block the first one, move the second one. And there's, you know, a lot of interest now also in the context of the COPs, etc. But the last round of negotiations was also very slow. You know, it's difficult to negotiate an international binding instrument. This is something that we should all bear in mind. It takes years, and then once it's adopted, it needs to go through ratification. So let's say Mexico doesn't ratify, it means nothing to us. Let's say Canada doesn't ratify, or the US, you know, things that are likely to happen sometimes. We can't use it in those jurisdictions, but we can use it in others. That's why we need to put efforts in a broad range of initiatives. Then there's an instrument. We don't really know the legal nature of it, whether it's going to be binding or principles and guidance on private and military security companies that are actually the source of violence against human rights defenders in many countries around the world. So this is an important one. And then we have regional developments. The Escazú Agreement in the Americas, the Aarhus Convention in Europe and Central Asia. These are, you know, instruments that bring in access to information, access to participation, and access to remedy components, and also protection of human rights defenders. So they are very important, and they touch upon a lot of BHR issues. We have a lot of private sector initiatives. I'm not going to go through this a lot, but there are, you know, from multi-stakeholder initiatives to help desks in business associations. You know, some big companies are conducting human rights due diligence. It would be interesting to know what's your assessment of those processes. I'm pretty skeptical in terms of the actual results, but there are some efforts. And, you know, ESG has or was becoming a very important framework in the financial sector. It still is, but there's a backlash there, as you know, that really hit the ground as of January this year. In terms of access to remedy, again, I think this, I resent when people say this is the forgotten pillar. You know, in the guiding principles, we have these 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is the obligations of the states to protect human rights. Pillar 2 addresses the responsibility of companies to respect human rights, which, let's remember, it's an independent responsibility, independent from the state's will or capacity to protect human rights. So they should behave well, even if they are operating in jurisdictions that are lax or don't have enough budget or tools or don't want to, etc. And pillar 3, which is access to remedy, it's not the forgotten pillar. I think it's the most challenging pillar, which is different. I think, for example, in terms of historic harm, things that haven't been solved from the past. I've engaged in conversations with companies that say, we know, like the sustainability people or the human rights people in those companies, they know they're lagging that. They know they have that, let's say, issue or problem coming from maybe a decade or 2 or 3 ago, and they can't address it because it's a legal liability, and legal never allows for human rights persons, for this team that are our colleagues, to address those issues. And that's why many companies that today are doing a better job still have a bad reputation, because they haven't addressed that. And, you know, we have persons from First Nations here and communities, you know, they have a long-term memory, right? Something happened 500 years ago, we still remember it in Mexico, right? So this is something that we haven't been able to solve in our community of practice, I believe. But there are some important, let's say, initiatives or some progress through national human rights institutions, through the OECD national contact points, also regional courts using the guiding principles. The Inter-American Court is increasingly using it just to say, you state need to tell that company to do the right thing or to remedy that harm. So that's also an interesting development. And there have been some historic rulings, for example, the Chiquita Brands ruling last year in the US, right? So I think there is some progress, but this is probably the most challenging pillar. And I wanted also to bring this in because I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the interpretation of the guiding principles, it's not it's not limited to what it's really written there, but it has been broadened and I think deepened as well by different courts and different bodies. The treaty bodies, for example, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has done some very important general comments that touch upon the responsibility of businesses towards economic, social, and cultural rights, like General Comment 24, for example. They are preparing now a general comment specifically on the arms sector, the defense sector. So this is also important. They contribute to broadening that interpretation. Other special procedures, so I'm part of the Working Group on Business Human Rights, which is it's a mechanism from the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. But back in the day, we were the only ones talking about business, right? Because by resolution of the Human Rights Council, we need to. That's our job. We are the thematic mechanism. But now other mechanisms, from the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, to the Special Rapporteur on the right on human rights and climate change, on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, on the human rights in the OPT, they are using now this framework. They are talking about the involvement of companies in human rights violations and other issues. So this is also important. We're broadening the scope of who is talking about these issues, who can use the guiding principles and other frameworks, and what are companies doing in different places of the world, in different thematic areas, etc. The advisory opinions of the courts. This is also something very important that happened this year, a few months ago. In July, actually, beginning of July, the Inter-American Court for Human Rights issued Advisory Opinion 32 on the climate emergency and human rights, and they had a very long part on businesses and what private sector actors should be doing, conducting due diligence, refraining from contributing to the climate emergency, etc. And then the ICJ on July 23rd issued their advisory opinion on climate change and human rights. And this is unprecedented. These are very important developments we've had this year, which has been a difficult year. So it's always good to remember that we still have new tools and things that are progressing. And then we're also using the guiding principles to other private entities. We're talking about sporting associations. We've issued letters to FIFA, to the Olympic Committee, to private education centers and universities, to healthcare providers. Wherever they act as a private actor, as a business entity, we can also ask them and pressure them to behave in a rights-respecting manner, complying with their responsibility. So that's what we've done so far. Now, this is a very complicated moment in time. So we're seeing this intersecting crises. Probably I missed some things. I'm not going to go through them, but I think this kind of shows that we're in a very challenging time for humanity and for societies. The climate emergency was already there. It's not that it gotten worse in 6 months necessarily, but other things did, right? Challenges to democracy, the rise of authoritarian governments, anti-rights movements getting a lot of funding, etc. And also the crisis of multilateralism, the defund of the UN. I know I'm happy to criticize the UN, right? But for example, the human rights mechanisms, we only get 1%. We used to get 4%. Now 1% of the whole UN budget, only 1% goes to human rights. And that is decreasing. So we don't even have enough tools to address these big challenges, right? We're also seeing some transformations that I think the question is whether they are part of the crisis or they could be an opportunity, right? There's this discussion on the new social pact. Last week in Doha, there was this summit, the development summit, and they were talking about, how can we renew trust with the societies? How can we really bring everybody into the development conversation and make sure no one is left behind, etc. So there is a question, how can we renew a social pact that leaves no one behind? Wealth is passing to new generations. In 5 years, we'll have a new generation of billionaires that inherit all that money. What are they going to do with it? There are changing dynamics in the geopolitical sphere. Maybe new leaderships can rise from that, right? In this new configuration, let's say. The role of private actors has changed over time. Some remains very problematic. Maybe it's more problematic now than before, but some is becoming more positive, let's say, or there is an opportunity there. And of course, the youth and the new organizing, how they use tech, how they use social media. I have 2 teenagers, so I tend not to be very discouraged by this new generation. Like, I sometimes tell them, like, oh, get off TikTok, like, that's garbage. But then I realize that there are other ways of organizing that maybe escape our, understanding, because we're a bit older. But I think there's hope there, and they have new tools to get together and discuss these things. And so I see opportunities and drivers for change. Of course, the normative developments, we never know where this is going to take us, because, again, omnibus, etc. But I think there are some interesting developments, strategic positions of some countries in international markets. For example, some African countries, some Latin American countries, some Asian countries that have rare earths and have copper and have lithium, etc. They have a great opportunity to do things differently, because we need that for the transition. Let's hope they have the courage to do so and really put some human rights and environmental requirements to that kind of activity. I think consumers, investors, there are opportunities for more pressure and leverage there to the business or the companies in the real economy. South-South cooperation. I brought in the ISDS after our the screening of the film yesterday. We were discussing a little bit about this investor-state dispute settlement system. And I think, when new trade agreements are signed, or new investment agreements are revised, we can try and challenge those practices and hopefully change them or substitute them for something else that can actually lead to human rights protections instead of ceding sovereignty to investors by states. And then social movements, organizing, communities coming together, workers suing companies, exposing companies, working on cases, really having a global voice in some spaces like COP now, for example, that it's happening in Belém, in Brazil. I think that is what gives me more hope. And finally, this kind of spaces. I think, researching, discussing, coming together, really creating space for political imagination. I really want to leave us all with that message. We need to have space to think, to create solutions, and to come together and have these discussions, because there's a desperate need for political imagination. We need to be able to think of a different way of organizing the economy and a different way of making sure human rights are respected in the context of business activities. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes now to open up the floor for questions.
Or comments.
Or comments. Or a combination of the two.
This is a comment and then a question. You had a slide up where you noted the Aarhus Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters, but you described it as a European and Central Asian treaty, which I know is actually not true, because the Aarhus Secretariat sat down with me for an hour a few years ago to say that they were really trying to promote the message that it is actually a universal treaty that all states can become a party to.
Okay.
And I followed it in the Canadian context. We are not a party, and we should be. And so I just wanted to make sure that was
happy to correct it, but it was developed in the context of
It was, and that it is no, and I think the first state parties to it were definitely that, but I think there's now a couple of African states. But the question, I guess, more generally is, I was very happy to see the environmental rights, procedural environmental rights treaties there, and I wondered if you could just speak a little bit more, perhaps, about how you see their significance.
Sure. Shall we take a couple more, or shall we? Is there another one now, or?
Okay.
Hi, Fernanda. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was taking lots of notes. One of the things you noted was the contrast between the development of the VHR binding treaty and the treaty on plastic contaminants, and you were saying one, which we know is not being supported at all by businesses, but one is. And I was wondering if you could provide any insights that you know about why that is, and maybe lessons that we can learn as we sort of bring to new processes.
Mind if I grab a few more questions?
one more maybe, and so I don't forget. Taking notes though.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Penelope Simons. I just wanted to ask you, because I know this is an area of specialization and research for you, but with the developments that at least we've been making in business and human rights with respect to gender and the literature and things like that, I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the political context now and what you foresee in that regard, and whether we're going to be pushing back or moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, let's do those three, and we can. Thank you so much. These are fantastic questions and comments. Noted for the presentation. But I'll really like to engage with the secretary more, because I had a different understanding. So it would be fantastic if you can connect me to them. That's great. Okay, cool. So on the environmental part, the guiding principles and the business and human rights agenda really covers all internationally recognized human rights. So, very late in time, because in the African and Latin American systems, we had recognized it decades before. The universal system, this pretentious name, so the international system, recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in 2023. So 2022, end of 2022, the Human Rights Council did a resolution recognizing this international human right, and then 2023, the General Assembly adopted it unanimously. So now, if you read the guiding principles, it talks about all internationally recognized human rights. Now this is, let's say, a new internationally recognized human rights. It automatically should be covered by any BHR, Business and Human Rights Initiative. And that's why what I always tell businesses. This is very well understood by academics, by civil society, by communities for sure. It's not necessarily well understood by governments, because they separate human rights and environment in different ministries and all of that, and by companies, which they might understand but don't want to acknowledge. I don't know. But they treat separately all their kind of human rights, due diligence or initiatives, and their environmental human rights, environmental impact assessments, etc. So my aim is to really bridge those two, not only mine, but of many actors in our sector, is to really acknowledge that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is an internationally recognized human rights, should be part of this agenda. And whenever that there is an abuse or an issue, a problem, a violation of that right, the effect, the domino effect in other human rights is huge. The right to water, health, etc. So the rights of communities. So I think that's why I really want to bring it in every time I speak about this issue. Same with gender. It wasn't really reflected here. I'll go to plastics in a second. But I'm a gender expert as well, and the working group has been pushing a lot for the incorporation of this intersectional lens into the business and human rights agenda. That includes the report from 2019 on the gender dimensions of the guiding principles, but also the report we did last year on LGBTI rights, and all the work we systematically do in the forums and in everything else, in all our endeavors, to incorporate this intersectional, broad, non-binary gender perspective, if you will. So we talk from violence against women and girls to the discrimination of LGBTI communities and everything in between. Now with the backlash against DEI initiatives, I think we have new challenges. I have engaged with a lot of companies telling them, you never want to overcomply. Now you want to overcomply on this one? Like, you really never want, you just want to comply with the bare minimum, and now you want to overcomply just in case? Because there's scrutiny from this big administration. Please don't do that. So that's kind of the tone of the conversation a little bit. But really, I think I really don't care as much, though I think it's bad to retreat from the public support to these communities. I think it's worse if you actually change your practice. So hopefully they don't change their practice, they just don't publicize it as much. That's, I think, where we need to push now. And some are still staying, committed, but many are not. So it's going to be a challenge, I think, in the coming years, but we should still bring it to the conversation. We'll have 2 sessions on this in the forum in 2 weeks. In a week? Oh gosh, in Geneva. So yeah, it's still a very important part, but it's part of the challenges, I guess, of the anti-rights movements, autocratic governments, etc. And on the plastics, I think I can find 2 differences with the legally binding instrument on BHR. One is these are actually companies and not business associations. You know, the ones that are involved in the BHR process is the International Organization of Employers and the International Chamber of Commerce in representation of the private sector. These people are not business persons. They are, you know, how do you call it? Bureaucrats? I don't know. Lobbyists? They are hired people by these associations to do this. They are not on the ground, like operating the business. So the perspective they have, it's more political and less practical, I would say. In the case of plastics, there's a coalition of companies, actually led by Coca-Cola, interestingly, to be involved. So it's actual businesses that use plastic in their operations that really want to have clarity on what's going to happen with the plastics they use, the disposal of plastics, the content of the in origin of the production of plastics. And I think this really speaks to their interest in their own operations, right? The other one is a broad thing that they don't even know where it's going, so they are not really interested, right? I think that's a key difference. Yeah. Okay.
We have time for maybe one more question.
I talk a lot. I'm Latin American. Sorry. Long-winded answers, but good.
Hi, Hassan Ahmed from Osgood Hall. Thank you very much for the presentation. You went through a number of different types of human rights violations, the history of it. I want to ask you about kind of the future. And one thing, I might have missed this, but I don't think you brought up was AI, artificial intelligence.
It is somewhere.
And
oh, I can't go back, but it's there in the challenges.
Okay. Maybe
it
you
is.
could elaborate on that to some extent in terms of the international, regional, or maybe domestic efforts that you see are taking hold with respect to regulating AI, mitigating the effects of AI, but perhaps speaking to it in the context of some of the kind of social ills that we're seeing around us, the idea of loneliness and isolation. There's claims against, for instance, OpenAI right now for deaths that have taken place through ChatGPT. So any efforts you see with respect to that?
Yeah, thank you. That's probably one of the questions of our times, right? I wish we had a collective answer to this, but at least a couple of things. I think there has been, or I've seen quite a bit of effort in terms of somehow regulating or putting some principles to the development of AI. Not that it's already there, but there's work towards it. In the EU, in some countries, there is debate, there is some work in the UN, in the Office of the High Commissioner on the development of AI, trying to put provisions into these developers in the big tech companies. I don't think we've been very successful yet, though, as you can see. But there's work towards, there's, I guess, a big kind of concern, an international consensus that this could be concerning, could be problematic, and we should do something about it. Much less on the use of AI. That's why we did a report last year on the working group on the procurement and deployment of AI, because governments are using AI. How are they using it? Health providers are using AI. A lot of other companies that are not tech developers are using AI without any human rights due diligence or any considerations of other impacts. I know it simplifies processes, maybe, automated process, etc. But the kind of consequences of that, it's not really assessed by those using it. So that, I think, it's a space for us to work more. It's like a blue ocean where we could be doing much more. In terms of the responsibility, I think, as with any legal liability, it's always difficult to tie the knot, But we have a big problem with this tech elite now, let's call it, because they are protected also by certain world leaders. So I think corporate capture there is very evident, and that's why we should never stop talking about corporate capture and the influence of these elites in democracies and in our lives. My concern is that this has become, they are trying to treat it as individual issues, like this kid wasn't really, like, it's a mental health issue of this particular person or this particular person, and none of these problems are individual. These are all collective societal problems that we should address together, and that's something that it's still a question mark. I don't know how we're going to do it. Aside of discussing it and putting on the table, I wonder whether we'll have the political will to really act on it during the next 4 or 5 years. So, TBD.
All right. Well,
Thank
you
you
very, very much. Please join me in thanking Fernanda.
Thank you.